Welcome everybody to the first Critical Antiquities Workshop for 2022. We're really happy to have Anthony Hooper here today. Before I introduce him and give him the floor, I wanted to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which both the University of Wollongong and the University of Sydney are based. They are the Darawal, Yuin and Wadi Wadi people of the Illawarra region, and the Gadigal people of the land on which the University of Sydney is primarily based. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and wish to express our desire to uphold the respect and traditions of their connection to country, which are deep and ancient, and therefore befitting of this critical antiquities network and endeavor. Our speaker today, as I said, is Anthony Hooper. Anthony is a colleague of mine, and it's a pleasure to introduce him. Anthony is lecturer in the School of Liberal Arts at the University of Wollongong. He works primarily on ancient Greek philosophy, literature and religion, though I want to say that he has broad knowledge on a range of wonderful topics. He's a great conversationalist if you're ever so lucky to be in his company. He has published a couple of articles and recently an edited book with George Gatsas. The title of the book is Aspects of Death and the Afterlife in Greek Literature, which was published last year with Liverpool University Press. And he's currently at work on a monograph on immortality in the Symposium. We're very happy to have him here, and we're very much looking forward to his talk today. The paper is, and I've lost the title. Anthony, do you want to tell us the title?
Yeah, I put on what it is as well. Erotic Androgyny and the Priority of the Feminine in Plato's Symposium.
That's the one. Perfect. Straight from the horse's mouth. So please join me in welcoming Anthony to the workshop today.
Oh, well, thanks so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you particularly for Tristan and Ben for giving me the opportunity to speak. Oh, and thank you, everyone, for your lovely emojis. Now, I just want to check that everyone has access to the PDF version of the handout in the chat. I dare say that I see Ben's just re-put it there, so everyone should be able to have access now. But I always sort of dislike the idea of people having to write notes, so all of your thinking should be overdetermined in material forms. You'll have a handout, and I'm also just opening now my PowerPoint slides, which I'll just make sure everyone can see. Can everyone see them okay? Yep, thumbs up, fantastic. All right, then let's get started. So, it's one of the central lessons of Plato's Symposium that few logoi are born of a single parent. And I begin by acknowledging the shared pedigree of this paper. I owe its inception to Dr. Emily Holm-Coetzee, who I note is here today, and Dr. Dawn Laval-Norman, who were kind enough to invite me to contribute to a panel on women in Platonism in the 2021 ASCS conference. It was a project that I took up with gusto for reasons to which the present company are surely sensitive. The study of ancient philosophy is not and cannot be justified through appeal to antiquarian interest alone, even though it's pretty good. Instead, a key role of academia is to establish and re-establish the relevance of texts for new generations in an emergent present. Submit them to examination and re-examination, evaluation and re-evaluation. In light particularly of the horrific insights into the continual omnipresence of institutional sexism and sexual abuse of women, and the forceful response of the Me Too movement, it is not merely appropriate but vital to cast our eye again on the depiction of women in the ancient world. This paper represents a modest contribution to this important discussion and an extension, if not a refurbishment, of my first pass. On first blush, Plato's Symposium, the text for today, represents thoroughly unpromising grounds for exploring, let alone celebrating, the feminine in the dialogues. Symposia, after all, were traditionally male-dominated spaces into which women were admitted exclusively as objects of sensuous delight for the men present. In this function, their key roles were that of either entertainer, instrumentalist, dancer, or singer, server, and of course, courtesan. Of the purportedly serious business of such functions, conversation with an eye to the moral education of Athens' young citizenry, women played absolutely no part, either as teacher, student, or even sounding board. The situation in Plato's Symposium appears more dire still, given that the earliest event of any note at Agathon's do is the dismissal of women from even these minor functions, so that the men could focus exclusively on conversation, free from the distractions that women apparently represent. To make matters worse still, each of the earlier speakers of the dialogue offers a thoroughly misogynistic account of Eros, all of which work in some way, if not possess as an explicit goal, to banish women and the feminine from the world of respectable erotics. If Eros is valuable, according to these accounts, it is primarily, if not entirely so, when it occurs between males. To borrow a phrase from Ben and Tristan's wonderful manifesto, it would appear on first blush that the Symposium constitutes a mere object of critique, our disposition towards which could only be mere negative. No, we must do better for women than Plato. Thankfully, fitting to his character, Socrates crashes this sausage party, dramatically reintroducing the feminine into the conversation through offering his own encomium through the voice of a woman, Diotima. Here, a glimmer of hope returns that women and the feminine may receive something approaching a fair shake in the matter of erotics. The argument of this paper will take place in two parts. The first constitutes a close examination of a key passage, in which I argue against the dominant reading, the surprisingly contentious claim that Diotima assigns a genuine and significant place to the feminine in respectable erotics. In doing so, I will argue that Socrates' speech elevates the Symposium from a mere object of critique to a potential standpoint of critique, a promising alternative disposition from which to assess and reassess the modern world. Such a reading, I am happy to say, aligns with a powerful new stream of interpretation in Plato's scholarship, in which Australian scholars, I note, are leading the way. I note the wonderful work on the Republic, particularly of Emily Coetzee and Lucy Smith in these areas. The second part of this talk is mercifully shorter. Here, I will outline certain preliminary thoughts regarding the value of the alternative presentation of femininity at play in an emergent post-Me Too present. I begin here by suggesting that in the relevant passage, Diotima does not merely admit the feminine as an indispensable part of the philosophical character, but moreover, at least in certain contexts, is of superior value for the philosopher than their masculine attributes. I present this paper in the mode, this part of the paper in the mode of invitation. I'm terribly aware of my own lack of adequate theoretical knowledge as well as practical experience regarding issues of gender identity in a contemporary context to advance these claims with any authority. So I enter into this paper in an inquisitive spirit, hoping to feast on the shared wisdom of my audience. So the focus of my examination is Diotima's opening gambit regarding the work or praxis of Eros, and I will read this passage. Of course, it's important. Given then that love is always this, Diotima replied, how will those pursuing it do so? And through what activity, if their intense eagerness in pursuing it is to be called love? What really is this thing that it does? Can you say? If I could, Diotima, I, that is young Socrates, certainly wouldn't be admiring you for your wisdom and visiting you to learn just these very things. Then she said, I'll tell you, it's giving birth in the beautiful in relation both to body and soul. It will take a seer, I replied, to see what on earth you mean. I don't understand. Then I'll tell you more clearly, she said. All human beings, Socrates, are pregnant both in body and in soul. And when we come to be of the right age, we naturally desire to give birth. We cannot do it in what is ugly, but we can in what is beautiful. The intercourse of a man and woman is in fact a kind of giving birth. This matter of giving birth is something divine. Living creatures, despite their mortality, contain this immortal aspect of pregnancy and procreation. It is impossible for this to be completed in what is unfitting, and what unfitting for everything divine is what is ugly, while the beautiful is fitting. Thus beauty is both fate and aletheia for coming into being. For these reasons, if ever what is pregnant approaches something beautiful, it becomes gracious, melts with joy, and gives birth and procreates. But when it approaches what is ugly, it contracts, frowning with pain, turns away, curls up, and fails to procreate, retaining what it has conceived and suffering because of it. This is why what is pregnant and already full to bursting feels the great excitement it does in proximity to the beautiful, because of the fact that the beautiful person frees it from great pain. For Socrates, she said, love is not of what you think, of the beautiful. Well then, what is it of? Of procreation and giving birth in the beautiful. And that's Christopher Rowe's wonderful translation. So while Plato is rarely wants to make things easy for his audience, the relevance of this passage to our topic, at least, is immediately evident. We have here a veritable cavalcade of terms intimately related to female sexuality. I've noted these in the passage on your handout. We have tiktain, giving birth, kuain, pregnancy, genan, bearing, and most prominently among the other sexual terms at play here, hodus, birth pangs. This point of the dialogue, at least, appears to present fertile grounds for a discussion of Plato's examination of women and the feminine, and perhaps even a positive evaluation of processes, activities, and states that are exclusive to women. Upon closer inspection, however, it quickly becomes apparent that Diotima is every bit the tease of a Socrates, or indeed a Plato. There are three issues that continually arise in the interpretation of this passage. So first, although tiktain, kuain, genan, and various other sexual processes here are most commonly deployed in the context of female sexuality, many, if not all of these terms, could be deployed to capture male sexual activity in a turn of the 5th to 4th century context. This can occur even in everyday speech. This is most evident in genan, which refers to either bearing or begetting quite interchangeably. Though most common in the middle, even the active tiktain can also mean begetting. Although far more atypical, kuain can conceivably carry the sense of being disposed to procreate. And even using hodus to refer to blue balls is not entirely without precedence. And there are even certain contexts, as we shall see shortly, in which these terms are deployed technically to refer particularly to male sexual processes. This is also the case for the sexual imagery that pervades the latter portion of the passage. While becoming gracious and melting with joy are most immediately present with female sexual phenomenology, these terms are not inapplicable to male sexual phenomenology per se. Given this, the femininity of these terms is not guaranteed. And so the characterization of this passage as a portrayal of the feminine at all is in question. Second, even if we do conclude that some or all of the terms, concepts, and imagery in this passage capture female sexuality, we are presented with a second issue, the apparent confusion, if not conflation, of female and male sexual processes at play. In place of an account that clearly delineates stages of intercourse, conception, pregnancy, and birth, we instead get the peculiar formulations that muddle the process of producing children. This is the most egregious of offenders here are first, the suggestion that all people, pantosanthropoi, are pregnant both in body and soul, seemingly covering both women and men, and skipping over the stage of conception soulepsis entirely. Second, the characterization that the intercourse, sounosia, of a man and a woman is in fact a kind of giving birth, seemingly conflating sounosia and the various stages that naturally follow conception and pregnancy to a tokos. And third, that birth necessarily attends beauty and that ugliness necessarily retards this process. The result is a frustrating hodgepodge of male and female sexual processes, which cannot be neatly untangled. Moreover, the attempt neatly to excise through clever semantics the male from this passage is equally as fraught as that concerning the female. After all, the same logic that takes becoming gracious and melting with joy as evidently female surely impels us to take contracting and curling up as evidently male, at least in the first instance. And third, in the event that one does, if one can, both establish the presence of genuine female sexual activities here and offer some account of their relationship with male sexual activities, the possibility is still present that this account is less championing feminine processes than appropriating and sublating them to masculine concerns. After all, regardless of how seriously we take Diotima's attempt to represent female sexual activity, is this not merely an analogy through which Diotima, or perhaps rather Socrates, treats her real object of concern, the tokoi of the soul? And procreation of this kind does not seem to require a female partner, and is not the lens through which Diotima considers psychic tiktane evidently pederastic, concerning the psychic productions that occur in the sunacea of two male partners. So these are the three operative questions. So despite certain similarities and acknowledged connections between attempts to address these issues, there are a surprising variety of answers to these questions in the literature, which cannot be easily grouped. However, for our present purposes, I will consider only two. So the first, I've mistitled that, I call the simple feminine reading, or SFR. Despite the preponderance of seemingly feminine terminology, I note that readings which take this passage to assign female sexuality any value, or even to concern female sexual processes at all, are incredibly rare. Indeed, perhaps the only scholar of note who has advanced such a reading in the past 50 years is Arlene Saxonhouse in 1984, so a paper that's getting on, whose own take can be passed as follows. By the way, I really love Arlene Saxonhouse, and I think that she doesn't get enough of a fair shake in contemporary Plato scholarship. I always think that she has interesting things to say. But anyway, 1, the activities here are genuinely feminine. 2, while there is no neat separation of processes of intercourse, conception, pregnancy, and birth, either on a physical or psychical level, there is a clear linear shift in priority in the passage from a male to a female perspective. The language of impregnation she speaks of as yielding to one of conception and birth. And third, the purpose of this passage is accurately to represent the feminine and then, quote, to accord the female a respected place in Athenian political philosophy, her characteristically political lens being telling here. The main problem that attends Saxonhouse's account is not merely that she too readily accepts one, hence why I've labeled this interpretation the simple feminine reading, but rather that she offers no first principles basis for this move. That is, she gives no account as to why Diotima introduces the feminine here, nor provides any philosophical justification for its inclusion within a more broadly phallocentric context. As such, the introduction of the feminine here on her story takes on the character of a just so story. To put it another way, Saxonhouse's interpretation is too narrow. She does not attempt to justify her reading of this passage in light of its wider argumentative or dialogical context. However, the real reason that Saxonhouse's reading, nor any readings that offer a positive answer to 1 and its consequences in 2 and 3, have gained any purchase is due to the long shadow cast by the second reading I consider, which I have entitled the Asclepian masculine reading, or AMR. AMR originates with J.S. Morrison in 1964, the first modern scholar seriously to treat the interpretative issues that this passage presents. It is a reading which finds ready acolytes in scholars as sensitive as Kenneth Dover, Christopher Rowe, most recently Angie Hobbs, and most importantly, Elizabeth Pender. I flag Pender particularly given that her 1992 paper now properly represents the landmark reading of this passage. Time permitting, I would treat her reading separately, but insofar as her paper represents an extension of a Morrisonian foundation, I will treat her study under this heading. To see the logic of AMR, I shift the order of answers to the key interpretative issues slightly, passing the reading as follows. 2, a neat separation of the processes at play in this passage can only be achieved through reading the terms and concepts Diotima applies here, not in their everyday sense, but in a technical sense. In particular, Morrison argues Diotima is articulating a view originating in Asclepian medicine that grants near total priority to reproduction to men, seeing reading women only as a receptacle of the male seed, and that's it. I pause to labour that it is an important implicit methodological assumption that a neat separation of concepts is a necessary condition for a reading to count as plausible and successful for Morrison. 1, As such, the relevant terms and concepts introduced in this passage, while capturing female sexual processes perhaps in everyday language, are used in a technical sense here to indicate male sexual processes. Kuwain, not to pregnancy, but rather the buildup of sperm in the male, and even Hodis to the retention of sperm and the painful pangs that attend the retardation of its satisfactory release. As Morrison states, quote, "It is strictly correct to translate Kuwain as to be pregnant and Hodis as birth pains. But unless the reader is aware of the reasons for Plato's application of these words to male procreation, the result is bound to seem ridiculous and often confusing." And the central motivation for such a reading is that Plato articulates a similar view to the Asclepian view in the Timaeus in the two passages which I have included on your handout, which I will unfortunately allow you to read at your leisure. They are cool passages though, so I think that you should. And then third, therefore, this passage represents less an attempt to represent and provide a positive evaluation of feminine sexual activity, but rather constitutes an articulation of a view that all but sidelines the contribution of the female in the process of reproduction. Indeed, the role of the female as the receptacle of the seed is entirely absent from this passage, although, as is Pender's key contention, not from Diotima's account as a whole. And this is a position which is then neatly extended into pederastic modes of education, which are entirely phallocentric, at least in a psychic sense. Now, despite the prominence of its advocates and the admirability of at least the attempt to derive a consistent account of the activities involved in physical and psychical reproduction, two important problems attend this view. The first and most important problem goes to the central methodological move, the appeal to the Timaeus to make sense of this account. I note that I have no major issues with Morrison's reading of these passages in the Timaeus, which I grant are broadly apt. That an Aesculapian doctrine appears in the Timaeus, of course, surprises me not a jot, given that the dialogue bleeds heavily, not just into the content and form of pre-Platonic medical thinking, biology and embryology, but into the broader project of physiology more widely. While acknowledging certain prima facie resonances with these discussions, it is important to recognize that the Symposium is a very different beast. In cases such as this, in which one imports a narrow technical doctrine of one dialogue, the pedigree of which is external to that dialogue, being itself borrowed from Asclepian thought, into another, to avoid the charge of an ad hoc move, some internal motivation must be offered. That is, it is necessary to demonstrate that it is plausible and not merely possible that such a doctrine is at play in the Symposium. That we are faced with an apparent confusing intermingling of male and female sexual imagery is not enough. What will be further needed is some motivation for this specific account here. The most likely place to derive such motivation would surely be the speech of Eryximachus. A doctor by trade, Eryximachus assumes the mantle of a representative of the medical tradition, and he frames his praise of Eros through a medical lens. Given Socrates' penchant for borrowing and repackaging elements of the earlier speeches into his own account, the presence of this, or indeed any Asclepian doctrine in Eryximachus' speech, would provide sufficient internal motivation for Diotima's inclusion of it into her treatment of the work of Eros. But while Eryximachus' extended treatment of the mantic arts as the supreme techne broadly recalls the mystical approach of Asclepian practice, he never touches on anything approaching the relevant Asclepian doctrine of reproduction. Indeed, discussions of human and animal sexuality and reproduction are tellingly absent from Eryximachus' account, the doctor playfully avoiding such topics in favor of a spicier treatment of the intercourse between mortals and gods. Moreover, the only thing approaching a medical doctrine here concerns the balancing of opposites, a Hippocratic rather than an Aesclepian position. Now, advocates of AMR at this point could respond that the purchase of this position extends beyond the narrow confines of medical thought, finding brief but notable references in poetry. There are references to the doctrine both in Asclepius Orestes and Euripides Hippolytus. One could press that this view should not be characterized merely as a niche, obscure doctrine, but a position that was familiar in wider intellectual circles. But I would be more convinced by the poetic pedigree of this doctrine were it not the few scant references now in a position to do such heavy lifting. To begin, such references in the tragedies surely possess far more the character of winking references than doctrinal commitments on the part of these poets. And among surviving material, it is Aeschylus who takes most pains to offer a nuanced articulation of the Asclepian tradition. However, Aeschylus is a poet who very much fades into the background in the Symposium. Euripides, it must be said, is indeed a prominent influence in this dialogue, being referenced by every speaker and in a frequency second only to Homer. However, it is the Melanope to which speakers most often appeal, the Hippolytus receiving no mention at all. Despite this problem, this reading represents a development on Saxon houses as it works to establish a metaphysics through which to ground the interpretation of the passage. The issue is that this metaphysics appears entirely inappropriate to the context. While Saxon house's interpretation is too narrow, the present reading is too wide. It seeks its metaphysics in a context too distant from the aims, themes, and concerns of the Symposium itself. Now, the second problem concerns the account of pederasty that naturally follows from this reading. This problem emerges most clearly, though not only, in light of Penda's more sophisticated resolution to the surface confusion the passage presents by constructing a fourfold system. And I've just put sort of a tab, I can't go into detail on this, on your handout concerning this, regarding the relationship between male and female physical and psychical production. Now, while Morison's focus here is to establish the sublimation of B to A on a physical level, for Penda, the real lesson is the construction of an analogy between A and C and B and D. And Penda understands her key contribution to the debate to be her recognition of D, which she argues is only implicit in this passage, but more properly at play later in Diotima's account and elsewhere in the dialogues, mainly in the Phaedrus. So particularly female psychic pregnancy here. For Penda, the key lesson Diotima advances is that a beloved is necessary for the production of beautiful and good logoi, which are produced in and gestated within the beloved. Hence, B and D capture genuinely feminine roles, but in the thoroughly minimalist role allowed by the Asclepian. The male is doing all of the work, and the logos itself takes on the character of the male and the male alone. The feminine is just, the female is just a receptacle for this. Now, initial purchase on the problem of Penda's account is the simple insight that, contra the logic she seeks to establish, Diotima never speaks of a lover producing seeds of either children, logoi, or virtue in N, the beloved. Instead, it is something which they produce and nourish together. But this points to the deeper issue of the model of pederasty that is implicitly applied in Penda's account and Morison's more distantly. Lacking modern conceptions of heterosexuality and homosexuality, the ancient Greeks were much more concerned with the position in sexual activity that one occupies. The received wisdom was that the penetrator assumed the masculine role and the penetrated the feminine role. Such associations attended pederastic as well as heteronormative relationships. The older man is the active partner qua penetrator, the younger man the passive partner qua penetrated. The conventional position finds a prominent, if boorish, advocate in the Symposium, in Pausanias, who commends the virtue of pederasty as a model of education. In this system, the young man exchanges the use of his body in exchange for the wisdom of the older. The boy here is again merely a receptacle into whom the older man, if you forgive the phrase, rubs off his phronesis. I see also Agathon hoping to catch some of Socrates' wisdom via physical contact at the beginning of the party, as though wisdom were an STD. The issue is that such a reading runs against the fine scholarship of figures such as David Halperin, and more recently Radcliffe Edmonds III, that Diotima's account represents at least first base of a thoroughgoing rejection of conventional concepts of pederasty, rounding third in Alcibiades' speech, and going all the way in the account of Anteros in the Phaedrus. For Diotima, in her words, and Socrates in his deeds, there is no room for a merely passive partner in the production of beautiful thought children and true virtue. Hence the role reversal at play in his relationship with Alcibiades, in which the young man seems to take the role of the lover and the older the role of the beloved. And what beautiful children they make, at least for a little bit of time. So although I dissent from such august company only with hesitation, I do believe that there may be a hitherto unexplored route by which more assuredly to navigate this passage. My own approach offers illumination through reading this passage in light of the characterization of its spokesman, or rather spokeswoman, Diotima. The significance of this passage comes into focus in recognition, not of the widely acknowledged fact that Diotima is a woman, so that would be boring and I would forgive you your nap, but rather that the female Diotima, along with the male young Socrates, represent two halves of a single unity, Socrates himself. The central concept which Diotima and this passage thematize is the Socratic posit that every lover, qua erotic, and a fortiori, the best philosophers, occupy an intermediary position between the male and the female. As such, they are absolutely reducible to neither of these categories simpliciter, but must rather manifest the masculine and the feminine in turn. In recognition of this fact, what will emerge is a passage that functions properly as a fertile standpoint of critique in the rich sense outlined by Ben and Tristan last talk. So preparing the way. My own understanding of erotic androgyny emerges from the important work of Frisby Sheffield, whose monograph still represents the landmark in Symposium studies. I note the irony of this, at least in the Morissettian sense of the term, given that Sheffield, more than any other Symposium scholar of note, gives shortest shrift to the issue of Diotima's gender and entirely passes over the operation of feminine sexual processes in our passage of concern. Nevertheless, acutely apposite for our present discussion is Sheffield's important insight concerning the function of Diotima and the foundation of Diotima's education in the art of love, erotic intermediacy. Erotic intermediacy represents Diotima's contribution to the evolving discussion begun in the earlier speeches regarding where to plot lovers in reference to the categories of mortals and immortals. Eryximachus sets the stage for this discussion by attempting to set up a strict opposition between the categories of mortals and immortals, particularly in reference to their relative possession of virtue, a task he performs with dubious success. Aristophanes then situates lovers firmly in the camp of aporetic, resourceless mortals, deprived not only of their other halves, but also entirely bereft of beauty and goodness, Aristophanes' speech being noteworthy for alone making no reference to these concepts. And Agathon then takes the opposing view, suggesting that those touched by Eros take on godlike beauty and goodness, setting up himself as one such blessed individual. Diotima's account of erotic intermediacy represents a rejection of the prevailing Eryximachean scheme. While Diotima herself recognizes mortality and immortality as existent operative concepts, and that the opposition between the two should be maintained conceptually, she tars Eryximachus with the accusation of committing a fallacy of the excluded middle. Mortality and immortality are not mutually exclusive options, but rather represent poles of a continuum. What all previous speakers have neglected is that there are beings which occupy a middle space between these two extremes, and Eros, and by extension lovers, are those who occupy just this space, hence her characterization of them as intermediary beings. Such beings have a share of both an aporia of beauty and goodness, that is characteristic of mortality, and the euporia of these features, that is characteristic of immortality. The first important consequence of this is that lovers are the kind of beings who in their nature are neither bad and ugly nor beautiful and good, but rather have a share of the two to different extents at different times in different respects. The second is that any beauty and goodness we have is a genuine achievement. Intermediary beings are not bestowed with beauty and goodness by their nature. Instead, any fine and virtuous character they possess is properly a construction. We are Diotima flags, works in progress, whose character is what we make of it. It is unfortunately far beyond the scope of this paper to go into detail regarding the implications of this account, but I can confidently state that everything in Diotima's account emerges from this metaphysical position concerning the nature of erotic beings. For our purposes, presently important is Sheffield's insight that the character of Diotima herself thematizes this important position. Sheffield finds it significant that Socrates' initial maneuver in his speech proper is to divide himself between an aporetic young Socrates, who is entirely ignorant of matters of love, and the euparetic Diotima, rich in beautiful and good insights regarding this matter. In this way, Socrates cunningly captures his own intermediary nature, his own share in both aporia and euparia regarding the beautiful and the good. Now, this, of course, is not the only way in which Diotima explicates and thematizes intermediacy. Her central treatment of this topic takes the form of a myth, the famous fable of Eros's lineage. I would enjoy nothing more than to pontificate on this passage for a protracted period, but I will restrict my treatment to one important insight, the characterization of Eros's parents. You'll forgive my delight in alliteration. Hopefully you've been spotting them throughout. Like all good fables, the key message of this story is simple to discern, even if yielding the full subtleties of its operation demand considerable sensitivity. Eros, as the offspring of Poros and Penia, has a nature intermediary between those of his parents. The characterization of his parents is simply achieved. Poros literally means plenty, and Penia, poverty, establishing a connection between the one and resource, and the other and resourcelessness. However, upon closer reading, these prima facie connections are complicated. First, the nominal characterizations of Poros and Penia are often dissonant with their action in the fable, and particularly their role in Eros's birth. The drunken Poros does not seem particularly resourceful here, providing only his seed and not even his consent to the birth of Eros. And while Diotima attributes Eros as a nature as a schema, epibulos, to his fraternal lineage, it is Penia who schemes, epibulein, to lie with Poros in the fable. This in turn confuses the ontological status of these figures, and it's particularly problematic to read Penia even as a god, given that she is so essentially defined by her resourcelessness. Indeed, as a late and uninvited gatecrasher to the feast, she is distinctly separated from the divine attendees of Zeus's party. But her ready access to Zeus's garden and her capacity to take advantage of a god, even a drunken one, also suggests that she is more than mortal. And even Poros falls far short of the perfect, rational, knowledgeable, beautiful, and good deities that are the preferred objects of Socratic imagining elsewhere in the dialogues, as well as that of Diotima herself elsewhere in her account. Both Poros and Penia reflect more the gods of popular storytelling, capricious, slaves to their desires, and almost ridiculous were it not for their prodigious power, and so barely gods at all from a Socratic perspective. Such complications in the characterization of Eros's parentage could be read as evidence of the philosophically unsophisticated character of the myth. However, I would argue that these features serve an important philosophical function. Sensitive readers come to recognize that the theme of erotic intermediacy infuses the passage more thoroughly than first appears. A close reading demanding that we understand Poros and Penia to manifest a similarly intermediary nature as Eros. The most immediate metaphysical implication of the ambiguities of the nature of Eros's parents is to emphasize the extent to which aporia and euparia are thoroughly and irrevocably entwined in erotic intermediacy, such that they cannot be neatly separated, either in an imaginative representation or a dialectical investigation. Hence why, I note in passing at this time, Socrates rejects conventional visions of pederasty. Mortals in general, and lovers particularly, are not neatly separated into wise and ignorant parties in turn, nor into active and passive partners. Erotic intermediacy demands that we recognize that we all have a share in aporia and euparia both, and our erotic activities and erotic relationships must be reflective of this. But more on this shortly. For now, I labor that, seen from this light, the apparent confusion in the characterization of Poros and Penia is neither evidence of Plato's intellectual laziness, nor Socrates' flagging an unphilosophical mode of presentation. Instead, the indissoluble entangling of aporia and euparia is an important feature of the passage, and any attempt to resolve it would consequently distort its message and diminish its force. So returning to the issue at hand, my innovative move here is to read the relevant passage through a parallel claim to that regarding erotic intermediacy. That is, I suggest that in the same way that it is significant that Socrates divides himself into aporetic and euparetic halves, so too is it significant that he divides himself into a male and a female half. Not only then does this move thematize erotic intermediacy, the idea that lovers are both aporetic and euparetic in their nature, but it also thematizes what I shall call erotic androgyny, that lovers, qua erotic, have both a masculine and a feminine aspect. To my mind, such an insight dramatically reorients our interpretation of Diotima's opening gambit regarding the work of Eros. So first, it being the case that the introduction of Diotima thematizes erotic androgyny, not only would prominent reference to masculine and feminine concepts, terms, and activities not be shocking, they would be entirely expected. Reading this passage through this lens would then provide important support for reading the passage as capturing both male and female sexual activity, and discourages the attempt to sublate the latter to the former, or indeed vice versa. And this is not just some just so claim like that of SFR, but one which can easily be seen to emerge from a solid metaphysical foundation, parallel to that of erotic intermediacy. But perhaps the most important development this reading both allows and motivates concerns the confusion of male and female sexual practices at play here. A common feature of each of the readings presented above was the attempt to offer an untangling of these processes, to divide them conceptually into a neat, discrete taxonomy. Read in light of erotic androgyny, however, there is strong reason to interpret the confusion of male and female sexual processes here, not as a bug, but rather as a feature of the passage. While it is certainly the case that certain terms and activities are more appropriate to female sexuality and others more appropriate to male sexuality, the passage frustrates any attempt neatly to tease them out. It is, of course, possible to a certain extent. Reading this passage in light of female sexuality alone is an illuminating but ultimately frustrated activity. And different things are then to be gained from reading this passage through the exclusive lens of male sexuality. But this too will remain an ultimately unfulfilled exercise. Hence why prominent authors who have read the passage in one way or the other never quite avoid its trappings. And indeed why Alcibiades has such a hard time capturing the nature of Socrates, having to turn to female imagery to capture him. He's either a flautist, like the flute players earlier dismissed, or a siren, or a creature of indivisible duality, like a satyr. As for the portrayal of erotic intermediacy in the figures that populate the fable of Eros's lineage, the indissoluble entangling of male and female sexual processes is a central feature of the passage, and one that thematizes the important truth of erotic androgyny, that all lovers, male and female, pantos anthropoi, have a masculine and a feminine aspect. However, despite this entanglement, I do broadly agree with Saxonhouse that the feminine comes to possess a certain priority in this passage over the masculine. This follows first from its dialogical context. The attitude of each of the previous speakers has not merely been one of passive neglect of the feminine in respectable erotics, but hostility. Against such a project, the prima facie shock of the relevant passage would surely be less that lovers are intermediary beings in respect to masculinity and femininity, but rather that they do, and moreover should, manifest femininity at all. And I would also advance shortly that this priority is also argumentative, that Diotima does indeed grant a practical priority to the feminine in the context of erotic possession, but more on that shortly. Read in this light, it would be naive to think that Socrates or Diotima are, of course, attempting a straightforward representation of female sexuality or the feminine. The terminology, concepts, and activities associated with this are indeed indissolubly tangled with that of male sexuality, but she would be giving it a fair shake. However, here arises David Halperin's worry, which holds him back from committing properly to SFR. Socrates may imagine himself feminine as well as masculine, but does any man have the resources to do so accurately? Relatedly, does this passage present a genuine attempt on Plato's, Socrates, Diotima's part to represent and indeed celebrate the feminine, at least in this context? And with this issue now pressing, I draw the first part of the paper to a close before pivoting, as I said, to the mercifully shorter second, appreciating that I have about 7 minutes left to stick to the time frame. So let us take stock and catch our breath. I've demonstrated this passage does indeed work to incorporate the feminine into respectable erotics, rather than reading the passage as banishing it thoroughly, as AMR holds. With this, I hope to have done enough to demonstrate that this passage represents a potential standpoint rather than a mere object of critique in the rich sense Tristan and Ben outlined last time. And our next task is to set the stage for the evaluation of this standpoint in regards to our operative critical goal, to outline a valuable alternative position from which to effect the transformation of contemporary praxis regarding these issues. So, I begin by stressing that I am, of course, ill-positioned to comment on whether Socrates succeeds in accurately representing the feminine. As such, the core project of this part of the talk will be to establish that Diotima's treatment of the work of Eros represents another instance in the dialogues increasingly recognized in which the feminine is given a positive evaluation. Of course, and indeed is given priority over the masculine. Now, of course, this will not be a metaphysical priority. Erotic androgyny demands that the pull of the masculine and the feminine are both indissoluble. However, this reality does not preclude a certain practical priority of one to the other, particularly within the context of the work of Eros. So I've previously characterized the relevant passage as Diotima's opening gambit in her treatment of the work of Eros, but Diotima then goes on to explain what this work actually is. Oh, that's what I've done. Which is in the passage here, which unfortunately for the time, I may just have to get you to read on your own bat. It is on your handouts, but suffice it to say the reason for her interest in these processes and terms is because they guarantee the goal of Eros, the permanent possession of the good. The issue is, what does a distinctly feminine frame contribute to our thinking about possession? So to expedite this matter, I will draw heavily on the work in this area by Alexander Neamas in 2 articles, which annoyingly enough, he published in the same year. So in his treatment of possession in Diotima's account, Neamas draws a distinction between 2 operative concepts. On the one hand, ownership, and on the other hand, possession, which for the sake of clarity, I will refer to as possession proper. Neamas describes ownership in the following terms. I may possess something as a detachable piece of property, the losing of which will have no effect on who I am, or as a genuine part of myself, which I can't lose without undergoing a serious change of my own. For Neamas, ownership is a disposition towards an object particularly associated with commonplace notions of acquisitiveness, egocentricity, domination, manipulation, exploitation, instrumental thinking, and invulnerability to the object. Most importantly, that which one owns is entirely fungible insofar as our disposition towards it is an accidental feature. Our ownership of it makes no significant difference to who we are. Owned objects can be gained and lost, therefore, quite without consequence. In contrast, he speaks of possession proper in the following terms. When I treat something as an end, I am willing to reconsider my desires and values as a result of taking its own desires and values into account. I treat it with respect, and I also make myself vulnerable to it. Vulnerable in that I am allowing it to steer me in new directions. I might not even have conceived without it. And in the other article, when I want to, which is broadly the same, when I want to make someone I love mine, I also want her to make me her own as well. I am willing to allow her characteristics, many of which I do not yet know, influence who I will be. And I want her to let features of mine help shape her own future. More importantly, I am willing to let us both affect each other by means of features that do not yet exist, but will come into being as a result of our interaction. According to Neamas, possession proper, unlike ownership, is a disposition towards an object that is associated with altruism, productivity, nourishing, supporting, the recognition of innate value, and most importantly, vulnerability. To possess something, rather than merely own it on this account, is to allow it to affect us, to nourish it, to make it part of ourselves, to live on its model, to let it shape who we are, to yield to it. Possessed objects are not fungible in the way that owned objects are, because our possession of them consists in defining ourselves subjectively and objectively in accordance with it. So I find Neamas's discussion here both wonderful and apt, But what I think that he has missed is that Diotima frames this distinction regarding these two concepts of possession as a gendered distinction. So in my view, lingering in the background of the passage is the speech of Pausanias. Pausanias' speech constitutes a vociferous defense of the conventions of Athenian pederasty. Liking the scope to consider this speech in detail, I note two features of the passage particularly. First, Pausanias, more than any other speaker, seeks explicitly to banish the feminine from respectable erotics. He's the most misogynistic of all. The eros of and for women is literally the child of a lesser god for Pausanias, who goes on to set up homosexual love as superior and alone properly Uranian. Pausanias' treatment of eros is thoroughly ensconced in the language of power. It is the power that, for Pausanias, constrains eros into forms, or into virtuous forms, or leads to its perversion. He speaks ad nauseum in this speech of the power of tyrants, norms, laws, conventions, reason, passions, elders, and chaperones. And I think that this is most tellingly shown in the present passage, which again, I'm sorry to say for time constraints, I'll have to leave you to read there. It is on your handout, so don't feel lost. But I note particularly that framing in terms of the manliness of Athenian pederasty, that unique manliness, and that deployment of the phrase that he catches his prey, catching up his prey, harpazdein being the relevant term there, and license. But despite his attempts to frame the pederastic exercise of Athenian pederasty in noble and fine terms, Pausanias' account of seduction, if it can even be called that, is framed as one of domination. It is a power play in which one seeks to seize one's erotic object, who in turn, properly overpowered, now grants the lover license to do anything with, or rather to him. And the standard of evaluation of the lover's hunt as worthy or shameful is simply a success criterion. If he wins, he's an alpha chad. If he fails, he's a beta cuck. As for so many of the earlier speakers, however, Pausanias' speech, overcome by its own bombacity, falls into contradiction. And here the speech is also telling when he continues that, once he falls in love, he will sort of request every supplication and entreaty. He's willing to submit himself to slave as no slave slaves, in that sort of boorish little bit of alliteration that he engages in there. So here the real nature of the Pausanian hyper-masculine lover is revealed. Far from being a sick, mad alpha, he has shown his true colors, slaving as no slave slaves, committing every act of obsequiousness and supplication to his beloved. The dominator has become the dominated. But most significant is again that Pausanias frames this relation in terms of binary poles of power. One is either master or one is slave. This is the dialectic of a masculine mode of possession, the mode of ownership. And it is precisely this model, I suggest, that Diotima hopes to negate through the dramatic reintroduction of the feminine in her treatment of the work of Eros. In place of the masculine mode of possession as ownership, so pitiably articulated by Pausanias, framing the matter of possession as one of power, Diotima substitutes instead what she advances as a feminine mode, possession proper on Nehemus's account. It is a disposition more fitted not towards objects, but other people, whom one treats as equals, in recognition that they have innate value, that they pursue their own projects, and that such projects are best tread together. In possession proper, one does not seek to dominate, exploit, and use other persons for one's own end, but is properly recognitive of the genuine value they possess, seeks to manifest the same virtues by which their beloved lives, such that there is properly no oneself without the other. The two become one. And in their joint love, they become productive, producing children that represent proper expressions of who they are, but only insofar as they are together. And given that lovers qua intermediary are androgynous, productivity and possessions of this kind is not merely the purview of women. While women alone may become pregnant and give birth to biological children, men and women both are capable of psychical pregnancy, such that even two men, though this pairing is not necessary, can express their love through producing and rearing beautiful logoi, an achievement of which they are properly capable only in facing the world together. This is the disposition a lover must have to the object of their erotic attention in order to achieve the goal of eros, the possession of the good, potentially even after they are no longer. It is only possible when one approaches the phenomenon through a feminine frame, the phenomenon there being possession. I conclude here by noting that, despite being absent from our original passage, the key sexual term that goes on to reoccur through the remainder of Diotima's account is trophe, nurturing or rearing. Again, a concept of key feminine import, and one which naturally attends the feminine phenomenon of possession proper. There is much more to say on these matters of possession and how this guarantees one immortality, but for this you will have to wait for the sequel that will be my monograph on this subject. But having established first that Diotima makes a genuine attempt to integrate the feminine into her account of eros, and second, assigns it a superior value to the masculine in the practical context of achieving possession of the good, in conclusion, I return to our key issue, the evaluation of the critical standpoint constructed in the Symposium with an eye to the transformation of contemporary praxis. What lessons of practical import can we take from Diotima's account? Well, in the tenor of opening discussion to the floor, I offer the following potential suggestions just to get us started. The first, the recognition of that an ancient figure, otherwise so associated with misogyny on traditional readings, can plausibly be read not merely to assign the feminine a place of value, but even superior value to the masculine. We can then reclaim Plato from the ownership of incels. But I think that we can do better than this. The key lesson of practical import, in my mind, and I've had wonderful discussions with my students concerning this, including some trans students whose insight I was very grateful, concerns the account of androgyny itself. In Erotic Androgyny, Plato invites us to conceive of each individual as occupying an intermediary point between the masculine and the feminine. Masculinity and femininity, like mortality and immortality, are real conceptual opposites, but they are not strict opposites, but rather constitute poles on a continuum. And our position on that continuum is not something externally determined. As intermediary beings, our possession of masculinity and femininity is not something that is granted by our nature. Instead, our relative possession and expression of masculinity and femininity is a construction. While Diotima does not deny that there are two sexes on a biological level, that people are born male and female, she does not recognize this as bearing significantly on the most important matters of erotics and philosophy. Like for our possession of the beautiful and the good, our gendered character is what we make of it. We are not masculine or feminine absolutely, but works in progress, capable of expressing both elements as we find best, masculinity and femininity, both being indissoluble features of our intermediary nature. Such lessons, to my mind, are significant for navigating the issue of femininity and its relationship to masculinity in the contemporary world. But I think that we've heard enough from me. I certainly have, and I'd be much more interested to hear your thoughts on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, for a very provocative reading of the Symposium. I'm going to open up the floor to questions, and I'll first of all just restate our protocols for questioning. So you can either put up your hand and ask a question directly, or you can place the letter Q, as Bob has already done, and you can either write your question and I'll read it out, or you can put the letter Q and then I'll throw to you, and that way we can keep the order going. Since Bob has jumped in before me, I'm gonna hand it over to Bob, and then I might just make one observation, which I think might be interesting. But can I just also begin by just saying what a wonderful paper it was, very thought-provoking, full of very interesting observations on a well on a well-trodden text. So so well done, and thank you, Anthony, for that paper. Bob, you have a question.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks so much, Anthony. I mean, it was a really, really wonderful paper, and to a non-Platonist, it was extremely accessible. So thank you so much. And just two sort of smallish questions. One is, I was just wondering whether you'd looked at sort of David Littau's book on the pregnant male at all, because I mean, I think his chapter on the Symposium might speak to your reading quite well. I mean, as a non-Platonist receives it, there's this sort of sense of privileging the model of pregnancy over a more sophist centered model of penetration and impregnation, which again I think it's nowhere near the same as your position, but it might speak usefully to it. The other one, I mean, is just, I mean, you've Aristophanes sort of floated by relatively briefly, and I just wondered, I mean, this wonderful notion of intermediacy that you were pushing in the Androgyny, it just made me thinking of Aristophanes myth, where obviously we do get a model of that intermediacy, but there weirdly the androgynous model is still so we can have intermediacy but between two men, and that is the privileged form, so that even when you get sort of androgyny of some sort as the preferred format there. So I just wondered whether there is a sort of an internal dialogue going on, and not just as to whether intermediacy is preferable, but whether a particular flavor of intermediacy can take primacy.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Bob. First, I'm going to disagree with you when you say that you're not a Plato philosopher. I think I've seen you in every sort of talk on Plato's philosophy in Australia for the last sort of 10 years. So you have to be an expert by now. The second is I haven't heard, I haven't encountered that book. So I'm still sort of getting grips on this terrain. So that's a wonderful addition, and I really look forward to reading that. Now, I'm so glad that you talked about Aristophanes, because I wrote 6,000 words on Aristophanes for this paper, which had to leave for that very reason. So the one thing I wanted, so of course, we already have an overriding treatment of androgyny, which has gone on in the Symposium. I think that what's really interesting is that Aristophanes now denies that there is the phenomenon of androgyny in the world. That was something which was a facet of the circle men in the mythic past, while tokens of androgyny now exist, but people now conform to being either masculine or feminine. And what I think is really interesting is that he then sort of says, well, what kind of lovers are going to be best? The ones who used to be androgynous, who are now heterosexual, or the ones who are male, and he basically just hand waving over lesbians and just going, and of course there are lesbians, but who knows about them? And he says that the reason why the masculine are of greater value than the feminine is because the post-androgynes is because when the post-androgynes come together in erotic union, the result tends to be production and productivity and a child. And the issue is that we have enough problems, let alone having children afterwards. And so he says that the masculine kind of love, which tellingly he says, as is manifested by these manly men here, Pausanias, who we've got this account from, and of course, Agathon, whom he famously satirizes as feminine in the Thesmo, are the starlets of, and I say that sort of intentionally, the starlets of masculinity, which are going on here. And the benefits of that is that not being tied down in their erotic enterprise to children, they, not being productive, are able to go off and do the serious work of politics. All very tongue-in-cheek, of course, but I think that all of these things are in the background, particularly that association of androgyny, or at least post-androgyny, with productivity. And Socrates, Diotima responding by saying, no, it's entirely the productivity, which is that bit. So I would sort of dissent from you by saying, I don't think we get an account of intermediacy there, because we're all sort of miserable. None of us are good or beautiful, and we're all sort of crawling around in the muck. But some of us are sort of rooting around in political spheres. Some of us are rooting around with children. But yeah, so that's my response. But thank you so much for bringing that up.
Thanks, Bob. Now we have a question from Emily.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anthony, for this talk. And I have exactly one regret about this talk being on Zoom, which is that you have a lot of good jokes in it. I found that laughing at. And then, I don't know if you got the like laughter feedback on, but wonderful is your beautiful alliteration and style tolerated, but should be celebrated.
Oh,
The question that I had today is, I really love the arc that this paper is taking, and I'm almost thinking of it as, in your response to the last question, as that we see a series of misfires through these different speeches on the topic of androgyny, or on the topic of what gender looks like in love. And so first we get the like hypermasculine one and something's going wrong. Then we get the idea of androgyny, but something's not being fully appreciated about it. And so then finally with diatima, we get like a full vision. The question I had, I think, can be put pretty simply, which is that I have, I guess, a fear that somehow Pausanias has recurred in Diatima's speech when we get that moment where we're moving from kind of the vulgar bodily pregnancy to the psychic pregnancy, which you described as being possible for both men and women. I don't have the text on hand, so this could be like a close reading issue. My perception of this in the past had been that we're meant to think that psychic pregnancy is predominantly, exclusively, something that men go through with other men. And so it's always felt to me like this really jarring moment where you have a very wise woman telling you about men's cognitive abilities and processes, and suddenly you're thinking like we're back in the Eumenides with Athena taking men's side or something like that, rather than anything sort of properly speaking towards, as you were bringing out, sort of the feminine as not just distinctive, but as having something that's even being graded above masculine erotics or something like that. So anyway, so that was the basic question was, there's a worry, is that a legitimate worry, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it was the thing that worried, for example, David Halperin, who's a much smarter fellow than me. And if it worries him, I dare say that it should worry me. Yeah, that he's like, aren't we just appropriating the feminine for this sort of psychical education, which is quintessentially masculine, which is manifest in the very event that they're at, this symposium, after we've dismissed the women. So indeed, you are right. So your intuition was correct. The masculine pronouns are entirely sort of present after that. It is a male lover talking to a male beloved. I don't think, however, we should look past, the irony then that it is the female Diotima who is speaking to Socrates here. So I think there, at least, we have thematically an example of how people can become, can sort of talk together to give birth to beautiful logoi. But then the issue being that she is a Socratic invention, so I don't believe that she's an historical figure. We were having a discussion beforehand where Ben was sort of writing a paper on Aspasia and the potential, and certain people who seek to say, well, Diotima just is Aspasia. I would say, my intuition would be against that reading. So that thinking, so I think that fear is a legitimate one. It's one of the things that continues to sort of we should be very critical about, like in a negation sense, if that is indeed something which Diotima herself, Socrates, maybe Plato is prescribing. But I think that if we can read this sympathetically, we can read it as a protreptic account. I don't read Diotima's presentation of any topic as the first and last word on any of these matters, even within the context of the symposium itself. I think Socrates knows that he's speaking within this masculine context, that taking a broad sort of pederastic male, conventional pederastic approach. And I think that rather than stirring the pot by then talking about how you could be having these productive discussions with women, or women could be doing it themselves, he's just implanting the idea and letting people draw the conclusion once they're committed to the metaphysics. So that would be a charitable reading, but in order to suggest that that's plausible and could, potentially address the concerns that, what worried contemporary scholars would have, those concerns are still there and more work would still need to be done. Yeah.
Can I, if I can respond really quickly, just something to add to that, I think, in support of that. I'm just thinking in the Republic, as you know, I've been working on forever, when we get this argument for the intellectual abilities of women, and then we like drift back into using, just talking about men as the rulers, and then we get the correction later of, and remember, everything that we've just said applies to women too. In a way, there's almost, I don't know, just from what you've said, I almost get this feeling of you really wish, or you feel what's lingering there is I mean, this is getting into speculation, but almost like Diotima as a woman can't over advocate for herself. And so what you're wishing is that young Socrates was more with it in this drama, to be like, and by the way, obviously you too, Diotima, could have this experience with me, like the one we're having right now.
Yeah, and not just you two, but hashtag me too, Diotima.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just to support, I think, what you're saying. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Thank you
for that.
so much. Yes.
And thank you for listening to it twice now. I feel very bad for you.
No. I really like getting deeper on it. Thank you.
So we have a question from Rick, and then from Julia.
Weren't you going to put yourself in here somewhere, Ben?
Well, I think it would be rude of me to insert myself using a chair's privilege to do that. So I will gracefully bring up the rear.
Fantastic.
Okay, let me begin. I just want to say I liked both that last question and your response to it. And I think as a general point in Plato, we do very well to remember that the speeches are always given in a particular context, though they have general application, but it's a particular context. And I like the direction of your response to that. Second, I want to echo what Bob said about what a wonderfully clear paper it was. And I learned so much from that paper. I think I had been swayed by a lot of you call it the dominant reading, the masculine reading. And I find that a very attractive interpretation. And I think you did a really good job to set up what that interpretation is and how you might begin to undermine it. So I have a really kind of very small question that's related to the masculine reading, might give you a little bit more fuel, but it also might be a bit of a double-edged sword. And it concerns the terms themselves, okay? And what you didn't challenge the masculine reading with the following thing. What would it take to separate off the masculine reading of those terms fully from their feminine concrete origins, right? I just don't know what it would take. I don't know how someone could do it, short of some really explicit statement that says, and by the way, by tokos, I don't mean anything like what you think I mean, right? So you could sort of challenge that. The reason I think it might be a double-edged sword, and I'd like to get your response to that, is that if it's really difficult to do that, then I also don't know. That's why I think you have to do so much work outside of the context of those terms to establish the primacy of the intermediacy. Okay, because you couldn't establish it from those terms alone, that they have both masculine and feminine readings. And I want to get you to maybe tell me a little bit more about what you think about the terms, because you, just as the masculine reading can't sort of hive it off, the feminine reading, a feminine reading can't do it either. Anyway,
yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that. I mean, you know, Plato being as he is, I wouldn't expect sort of like an Aristotelian, or even demand an Aristotelian, like, you know, declaration. By these terms, I am meaning these in the way that sort of like Alcmaeon did. I wouldn't expect that. But as I said, I mean, it, like, you know, on the appreciation that Diotima's account is engaging dialectically with those that have come before it. As I said, if we had some sort of like really clear Asclepian articulation of a medical view in Eryximachus's speech, I even granted that in my talk as being sufficient for me to sort of say, oh, okay, you're probably on the right track, or I'm going to have to do a lot more work. And my issue is that I just don't see that in Eryximachus. I just don't see those kind of narrow doctrines, and I don't see sort of Asclepian medical doctrine there. And of course, it like, you know, sort of Diotima could be slightly less subtle, and she could like quote Alcmaeon, you know, sort of Socrates does that sort of plenty of times, you know, quote something from someone just to get it in people's minds, to get that to be the operative point. So I don't demand much, but as you said, I need more than nothing. And I need more than just, hey, if we read it this way, then all of a sudden I don't have to think about this passage anymore, nor admit the idea, which may have been sort of, you know, scary back then, or at least sort of like unconscionable back then, that Plato might have given women a fair shake and said, you know, actually that they are valuable and femininity is valuable. But in terms of where intermediacy is, I suppose that, again, I would sort of press the context in which this emerges. So the dialectical operation of the introduction of the feminine by a woman in a context that has denied it against Aristophanes, and in light of all of the people who have basically said, no, we shouldn't talk about women in the context of erotics. So I would say sort of like, first, the fact that we do have this confounding of masculine and feminine terms. And the second, sort of like the fact that it would be incredibly shocking after everything that has come before, you know, conceivably, you know, we've missed out on speeches, 1 hour, maybe hours of people going on about how it's all just about men and women shouldn't be involved. And then all of a sudden, someone is talking about pregnancy and reproduction, but also shrinking up and curling away. So I would say evidence in the text itself, with the fact that we have this confluence of masculine and feminine terms, and in its dialectical impact in reference to what has come before.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rick.
Julia, you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you, Anthony, for a wonderful paper. I joined the chorus, and I would like to say, first of all, that I think that, yes, we have to go all the way for the feminine reading. We have to forget about the hermeneutical imperative of exposing appropriation here, that Plato has done better than that in the Republic. Yes, thank you for bringing in that line of thought to the possibility for women to be educated to perform like men, with all its uncertainty back and forth. I agree completely, but still it's there. So let's go for the feminine reading. It has been done one step here, one step there. And I would like to ask a question, which is perhaps a suggestion and a comment at the same time, which is that, what would you say if I were to put to you the fact that one of the major reasons why we have to go for the feminine paradigm here as a real paradigm, well, is less the sexual aspect of the kind of situation that Diotima depicts and brings to fruition at the end of the drinking party, but the gynecological part of it. Because, you know, I have followed the way you negotiate through the vocabulary, and between precisely the sexual moment and the pregnancy laboring moment, which is much longer.
Yep.
And you know, the aspect of the painfulness, of the painstaking process in which giving birth consists, and this is, I think, not a detail. Why? Because, you know, in the very passage that you have shown to us, at some point, the accent is placed on kalone as a leituia. And therefore, if we focus on that moment, suddenly a different scenario comes to mind. And this different scenario is how difficult knowledge is, how difficult pushing out those logoi is, and how dependent the male psyche, I would say, or the male subject or agent is dependent from the help of someone else. In other words, you have an incredibly weak metaphorical projection of what it means to think and to speak here for a man, because precisely the point of this very alive metaphor, an incongruous metaphor, and I think that Plato wants us to be surprised again, again, and again, is to say that you young men who think that you are in control, you are so smart and so able to speak with other men, actually, you are a laboring woman at the mercy of someone who can perhaps help you give life to this famous logoi. In other words, it seems to me, and this is, I formulate it as a question, but I've been turning around this for a while. We should read Diotimus' speech with the Theaetetus, not only with the Republic, which is, I think is very important as another text, but with the Theaetetus, because there you have a full-fledged representation of what a mathematician is. Okay, what someone who is extremely smart and promising and capable cognitively, intellectually, well, this young man is actually a woman in labors. And without Socrates as a midwife, he wouldn't be able to give birth. So, you know, I think that perhaps if we bring Socrates' mother and Socrates' own female inheritance and genetic vocation from his mother together with Diotima, we have the dialogue as a somehow androgynous scenario, structurally speaking, because all those young men are all women in labor, not women in love, but women in labor. And Socrates there repeatedly doing the job of the midwife, a job that Diotima will do with him, because after all, Diotima's intervention is with Socrates, young Socrates, is not any form of lecture, it is an elenkos. So, you know, he goes through the painful things. So just to say that I'm 100% on board, but you know, trying to pull the metaphorical paradigm here, once again, I think it's not just a way of speaking, it's really a way of mapping what philosophizing is, pulling in on the side of the sort of giving birth and laboring. Knowledge is difficult and conflicting, and you need the help of that woman. Sorry, I was long, but I...
No.
Paper.
First, it's nice to meet you, Julia, and second, I so appreciate your comments. So yes, absolutely. I mean, how easy things would be on that other model that we have, like we're sort of like an ownership conventional pederastic model, which, as I've suggested, sort of Agathon seems to suggest when he says, first, come here and rub up next to me, Socrates, such that I can partake of your wisdom. It's like all you need to do is just sort of like impregnate someone with wisdom, and that's all that needs to happen. And then following that, you're wise. And of course, that's Alcibiades' exchange as well. He said, you know, if we spend a night under the blankets and I give you use of my body, you'll give me wisdom. And Socrates is actually like, no, we're going to have to both work at this. It's hard. And Alcibiades is just like, well, screw you. Like, you know, I'm out if you're going to sort of blue balls me. And he's like, I'm not blue ballsing you. I'm seducing you. I'm not just, you know, if you pardon the expression, I'm not just going to fuck you with wisdom. I will seduce you with wisdom. So I think that's entirely the case. But of course, the point of this model, the Asclepian model, I think is actually really telling for the Symposium. Because in my view, sort of in response to Camptokar, what are we adding to the claim that, you know, this very new idea of desire in Plato, that desire qua desire has the formal feature of aiming at what is really good. I think that the Symposium cast that quest in a generational process. And the point of the Asclepian view is to deny the mother any influence on the nature of the child. So I think, as you said, it's really significant that his mother was a midwife. Although, as Harold Tarrant says, it's likely all women were midwives back then, that, you know, he questions, as in a wonderful article from the late 80s, I think, whether there was such a job as being a midwife or as something just that women in the community did. But I think that your appeal then to the Theaetetus and the image of the midwife is apt, very apt. And importantly, I think that, you know, the intercourse goes both ways. because we have this perspective in the Theaetetus. Socrates says, I am not fecund, I am just a midwife. But read in light of the Symposium, I think that we can see that as an act of irony. In as much as midwifery bears on the Symposium implicitly, so too does erotic androgyny bear on the Theaetetus. So I absolutely think that it is important to recognize that. But one point I say in response, so I didn't put Radcliffe Edmonds' paper in the bibliography because I'm an idiot, but it's his 2000 paper, and the first bit, it's got a subtitle, is called Socratic Midwifery. And he says on the third page of that article, and of course the reference to midwifery is there in the Symposium and the Theaetetus. And he gives a reference to it in the Theaetetus, but he doesn't give a reference to it in the Symposium. And the amount of hours that I've sort of read that article and then read through the Symposium, which is the basis of that whole article, I think it's right, but I think it was built on something a little bit tricky there. I don't see any direct reference, but I think to this midwife image, but I think that sort of taking a interdialogical perspective, it's so much richer to read these sort of feminine images as mutually sort of informing one another. Him as, erotically androgynous, him as a midwife, and also someone, I think Martha Nussbaum might have written an article on this, him as a weaver as well is the big sort of third way in which Socrates casts the philosophical project in feminine imagery.
Well, if I can rebound just for a second, sorry, Ben. Well, I think that eleithuia is a very, very strong cue because, in the cultural, literary, mythological memory of the listeners or readers of the dialogue, if you talk about eleithuia, you have the Homeric hymn to Apollo that comes in, you have all the scenario of, the mess and the catastrophic kind of risk and danger, and above all pain that precisely giving birth is. And I've come back recently to this precisely, suddenly say, okay, what did the ancients think about the situation of labor and this pain? Nicole Leroux had written this wonderful paper on precisely female pain as a paradigm of pain in the Iliad, including in the Iliad. So it seems to me that if you pull eleithuia, the presence of Kalone, of beauty as the goddess who helps you give birth, then the whole aesthetic scenario becomes, in a sense, recentered on the terrible challenge of giving birth, where there is something that wants to come out and your belly doesn't let the baby come out smoothly. So I really more and more think that Plato wants us to think about that, the challenge of letting the baby out, which requires time, charms, enchantments, etc., and the presence of beauty. So beauty as a midwife, it's incredible. It's not the beauty of the boy becomes the midwife. So that
I'm convinced. I'm completely convinced by your point.
Massively there, but sorry.
Yeah, that's a wonderful evidence. I love
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, okay, we are sort of getting close to time, but I might just see if I can't just jump in with a concluding couple of remarks and observations. So the first, it's more of just an addendum, and perhaps it might be useful, might not be. Of course, we have other models for this idea of Socratic idea of philosophy as mediator outside of Plato. So, for instance, in the fragments of Aeschylus, we have the idea that it's not a kind of sexual encounter, but more of a kind of ecstatic bacchanalian encounter. So Socrates says to Alcibiades, there's nothing I can do that can make you love me. and there's nothing I can teach you directly. I can only be near you, in the same way that when Dionysus arrives, milk and honey kind of spontaneously sort of pop out of the ground for the Bacchae. So too, when I'm around you, hopefully you will kind of sprout knowledge and wisdom. The other model is the model of the matchmaker, right? The promnestea. And the matchmaker is slightly different to the midwife, right? There's mediation, but matchmaking is very different. Of course, this now allows us to segue to this question about the historical diatema, about which I agree with you completely. It's unnecessary. But then again, perhaps we needn't make a decision between the real and the imaginary here. We can say simply that that there are all sorts of historically contextual and valid reasons why we might think of Aspasia when we think of diatema. So for instance, this very, very important genealogy of Eros that you mentioned, Poros and Penia. Poros, of course, is a very important word in late 5th century Athens. It's very much on their mind, the question of revenues and resources, right? Poroi. In fact, they even had a new magistrate that was appointed in the 420s called the Poristes, one who was responsible for seeking extraordinary sources of revenue. And according to the scholion to Plato's Menexenus, we discover that according to a fragment of Callias's Pedatai, says that the son of Aspasia and Lysicles, the sheep seller, was Poristes. Right? Oh. So we have a comic genealogy which echoes the genealogy of Eros, that includes a notion of Poros there. And we also know too that from Plutarch's Life of Pericles that Aspasia was constantly lampooned in old comedy through the use of genealogies that echoed Theogonies and so on, right? She was the hera to Pericles' Zeus. Pericles was called the Olympian. She was called Hera, descended from sodomy and so on and so forth, right? And of course, the name Diatema means honored by Zeus, right? Dios Tima or something like that, in which case there may even be Plato kind of pointing at an old comic, well-trodden joke about Aspasia being, you know, the daughter of Metis or the daughter of sodomy or the wife of Zeus or the hero, or even Omphale to Pericles Heracles, right? And there's gender mixing up there, of course, androgyny and transvestitism and so on going on. So I think Aspasia lies behind Diatema, but not for the reasons that Armand d'Anjou suggests that they are, right? I think we can do a little bit better than his gut feeling that Socrates was on the island of Samos when he was 20 and bumped into Aspasia and she taught him about love and so on, right? But I think everything that you've said in your paper, and these are just observations and I'm just adding to them because they're so stimulating. I think everything you said in your paper was fantastic. And I particularly liked when you said about Poros and Penia, that they switch roles, right? That Penia is the one with resourcefulness and that Poros is the one who's indolent and seems to be adrift. And that this makes of that erotic genealogy something so much more interesting and so much cleverer. And I think if for that only, I think it was a wonderful paper and a superb contribution to the Critical Antiquities Workshop that Tristan and I have put together. And I also thank you very warmly for peppering it with references to our public lecture. And so thanks for the plug. You know, there are t-shirts on sale in the gift shop. But can I just round all of this off by thanking Anthony for a wonderful paper, and also to thank all of the questioners for superb additions and addenda to that contribution and making it such a fantastic presentation. Thank you.